Okay, so I think everyone can see my my screen. So this talk is going to be, I guess, slightly different, perhaps from the rest of the talks that you'll have seen for this event, because I'm not using slides. This is a browser, and I have the console log open. So a friend of mine actually told me that you can style the console log, so with CSS. So I did. So the title of the talk this afternoon is how to learn a bit more about the modern CSS layout techniques like Flexbox and Grid with the help of DevTools. For this presentation, I'm using the Firefox DevTools for numerous reasons, which I will explain in the upcoming pages. So I'll be explaining each of the CSS layout techniques in chunks, in sections. So let's start with sort of an introduction. So this will be relevant for the rest of the other demos that I'll be showing. So one of the things that I want to start with is something called content-based sizing. Because usually when we try to style our web pages, we kind of do need to size our boxes in some way. And very often we would use CSS lengths to do it. But there's another option that is, I would say, it's something that is old that has become new again. How so? Because if we talk about traditionally how the browser works, right? Any text on the browser, it's sized automatically by default, right? Like if we have a lot of text on a page and you do this, right? Which I'm trying to resize my browser. The browser will just reflow the text. It knows, right? It won't overflow over the page unless we do something funny. So browsers have always managed to figure out how much space that content should take up without any intervention from us, the developers. And content will automatically just reflow without overlapping, right? But there's there's an extension, let's call it, that is covered in a particular CSS module. It's called the CSS intrinsic and extrinsic sizing module level 3. And what this introduces, it's 3 new keywords to allow us to size our boxes, our divs, our elements, based on the content that's inside, which is something that is slightly more advanced than what we used to have. And I think it's really useful. And these 3 keywords, in moving forward, we can use them for sizing in terms of width and height. So the width and height properties can take in these additional keywords. The support is not complete at the moment, but if you're on a fairly newer version of, say, Firefox or Chrome, min content and max content can be used, as I'm showing on the screen right now. So I'm just going to highlight this so we can talk about this together. This is a box, right? And it's sized with min content. Hope that everyone can see here. And what does min content mean? So min content essentially just means it's the smallest size that your box can shrink to without the content overflowing out of the box. So for this particular example, I've used English in this sentence, and you can see that the width of the box is actually the width of this, I'm trying to highlight this here, content plus the full stop at the end. And the browser will treat this content plus the full stop as a single unbreakable entity. So for many languages, for example, like English, and even Russian, right? The line breaks will occur at word boundaries. So like this box is breaking, it won't break between SIZ and break it. It will treat sized as a single word, for example. And so this is why the width of this first box ends up being the length of the longest word, so to speak. But for other languages, the language behaves slightly differently. So for this second box, right, this is a series of Chinese characters, which uses it's a different script. It uses Han characters. And for Han characters, these are usually used in languages like Chinese or Japanese. The break is per character. So each of these square characters will break. So when I size this piece of content using min content, the width of the box ends up being the width of 1 character. What's interesting about these square characters, like Chinese character, like this for this language, is that even the punctuation given the punctuation is a full width punctuation, so I'm going to try to type a comma here. So even this comma punctuation, it's a full square width, and then as such, the browser will not break the sentence at the punctuation. So the browser kind of has a logic depending on the language on how to break lines. And so now this box becomes a width of 2 characters. And aside from this, there's also some Southeast Asian scripts like Thai, where the line breaks don't even occur at the word boundaries, not just the word boundaries. So I'd like to call your attention to the second set of examples. And this is a Thai example. And it's a sentence, it's not a single word, but there are no spaces between the words. So for those of us, I personally don't speak Thai. I mean, if anyone in the audience speaks Thai, great. But for those of us who don't speak Thai, we can't tell. We won't know where the word breaks. But the browser actually does. So there's a lot of logic that's encoded in the browser that can detect different languages. And so tying back to the mean content example, this is actually the longest word in that sentence. And that's how mean content sizes the box. So we were talking about max content, right? So the next thing, let's talk about max content. Max content is the opposite of mean content in the sense that it is the box's size on a given axis. So this is like the horizontal axis. When there is a lot of space, the browser is going to size the box max content into a line. It will take up as much space as is required to lay out everything on one line without breaking. So when there's a lot of space here, everyone is it will size to a single line instead of breaking, like in the first example. So the third keyword is, as you can see, slightly different because it's essentially a function, right? Because there's these parentheses. For now, unfortunately, it's not supported in browsers as a width yet. So if you look at this example, which I'll highlight here, the browser should tell me that it's an invalid property value. That's because fit content isn't supported as a width value yet, but these content-based values are all supported if you use grid. So I'm just going to use this grid example to kind of explain how fit content works, because it's slightly more complicated. So this is a mean content size. So let's just look at the grid here. So I've sized the first column with mean content. The second column is sized with max content, and this third column is sized with fit content. So as you can see, I can define a width inside this fit content function. So how this works is that, okay, if I try to say this out in words, right? Fit content is actually a range. The range, it is the range between the minimum content size and the maximum content size. But the maximum content size, it will be sized, the maximum width will either be the max content size or whatever you put inside this function, whichever is smaller. So this is a terrible thing to explain with words. So let's just look at the example. So when I highlight this box, the browser should tell me how wide it is, but if not, let's just look at the box model here. So this box is about 298 pixels, taking into account there's a 1 border each, because I put in a value of 300 for fit content. If we look at the second box, this one which is sized as max content, the content itself is actually about 480 pixels wide. So now, if I change the code, instead of using fit content 300, let's change it to a value that is bigger than its max content. So I'm going to change it to 500. And then let's expand this a bit more. So what you can see here is I can highlight this again. And please continue to look at the box model, right? It doesn't go beyond its max content width. So it's still 480, even though you put 500 in the function, simply because that's the cap. So it will be kept at either the max content width or whatever value you put inside the function, whichever is smaller. So that was what I was trying to explain. So these are the content-based sizing options that we have, and I've already showed you that you can use them in grid, and we'll talk about grid in a few other examples. But before we talk about grid, I think we should actually talk about Flexbox, since Flexbox came first. And I think Flexbox can be quite confusing, even though Flexbox has been out for a while. Flexbox itself, right? If you've not used it fairly often, it can be very confusing simply because when we use Flexbox, the size of the items that we are showing, that we are trying to define, might not end up being the size that we actually write in our code. Let me try to explain this again in words. Like if you usually when we size something, we say, oh, width 100 pixels. And the end result is very straightforward, like the width is 100 pixels. But when you use Flexbox, the browser actually does additional calculations on your items. And so whatever values that you put in might not be the end result. So I think what's important to realize is that when you're using Flexbox, whatever values you use are used as a starting point for the browser's calculation. And the reason why I mentioned using Firefox for this is because Firefox has this particular tool in their layouts panel called the Flexbox inspector. So if you look at the markup, the inspect element part, if you're using Flexbox on any of your elements, you will have this tag here that you can actually click on. You can click on to toggle this Flexbox inspector overlay. So I'm just gonna make this a bit smaller. So what the Flexbox overlay does, it shows you a few things. So you can either toggle it from here or you can toggle it from the layout panel. But what it does is that it shows you the outline of each of your flex items, because once you size a parent with display flex, all the children become flex items. And it also shows you the amount of free space available between your items. So it kind of have this like pattern dash thing. So that's the free space, but your entire container is the whole thing. So you can see your container, you can see how much space your items take up, and you can see how much free space is left inside your Flex container. But what's great about the Flexbox inspector is the fact that it tells you what the browser does to your item when it resizes it. So it actually shows you the numbers and the calculations. And the bottom examples will show this more. So I'm gonna briefly show this. So Flexbox actually has a few keyword values, and they resolve, Flex itself is a shorthand, and it resolves to these three values called flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So I think the key to understanding how sizing works in Flexbox is this last component of flex basis, because the calculation that the browser does to size your item is heavily dependent on this flex basis value. So moving on, let's go down to the next example, right? So this is this is content, and these two examples are very similar in that the first two columns have the first two boxes have the same content. Only the last box has different content. So for the second example, the last box has a lot more content. But if you look at the code, so let me highlight the code for this. The code that I use for both examples display flex on the parent and nothing on the children. So both examples have the exact same code, but both examples give you different sizing. And this is because the amount of space that the content takes up impacts how the browser sizes the item. So let me first try to expand this until there's lots of space. So where there's lots of space, under these circumstances, you'll notice that, oh, okay, the first and the second box is exactly the same width. So if you remember that I showed earlier, if I don't set any flex value on the flex item, the default value is a flex grow value of 0, which means even if there's extra space, the box not going to grow. But it has a flex shrink value of 1. So that just means that if there's not enough space, the box is going to start to shrink. And that's the reason why, like at about this point, when there isn't enough space left for the second set of content, all the items start to shrink together. Now, the first box is not going to shrink because, as we explained earlier, the browser will not shrink anything less than the main content. So this stays the same. But there is room for shrinking for the second box, and it starts shrinking much earlier than the first set. So that's why when I first showed this example at about this point, you'll realize that the second box is already much smaller than the first one. And that's because it has started shrinking, but the second box in the first example hasn't started shrinking yet. So that's how flex shrink and flex grow would work. So depending on the values that you set. Now, if we don't set anything for the flex basis, it's going to resolve to the content size. And you can see that from the DevTools. So I'm just going to highlight this last one. So when an item shrinks, the Flexbox inspector very helpfully tells us that the starting size for this particular piece of content was actually about 1023 pixels. And because there wasn't enough space left in the container, it has shrunk. So it's actually informing us that, oh, okay, for this particular flex item, the shrink value is 1. And at this point that we are inspecting right now, it has already shrunk about 400-ish. So the size that we are seeing right now, it's about 597. So I think this is a pretty useful way. Like before I saw these numbers, I didn't really know, like I couldn't visualize what was going on. But I don't know, seeing these numbers actually helped me with the mental model of how Flexbox would work. And so I'm hoping that it can help. I know this method is not for everyone, but I'm hoping it can help some of you kind of wrap your head around how Flexbox works. And I think one of the more interesting things about how flex basis behaves, right, is that flex basis, although you can set a fixed value for it, there are also some keyword values. And what flex basis does is it does impact the starting size of your box. So now let's kind of do put some values for flex basis on this particular item. So I'm going to keep the grow and shrink values the same. But no, you know what? Let's not do this yet. If I give the element a width, the starting size, which is before the browser does all the flex and grow calculations, the starting size becomes 200 pixels instead of the content size. The thing about flex basis is that it will override this width value. So if I actually put in a flex basis value of 300 pixels, the browser is going to tell you that now the starting, even though the base size, the width is supposed to be 200 pixels, because I set the flex basis to 300, it's using 300 as its starting width to calculate itself. So that's, I guess sometimes, and for this particular example, because I'm not setting it to grow, sometimes you may wonder, like, why are you setting a width and your width doesn't take, right? Like I'm setting 200 on this, but it ends up being 300. Sometimes it might be the flex basis value. So maybe that's something to check if you have a oddly sized item. But flex basis also takes in keyword values. And I want to make the distinction between the keyword value of auto and a 0 value. So let's look at the third set of examples. Moving on. Again, exactly the same content, it's just slightly different flex values. So for this first set of examples, the flex basis has been set to auto. And what auto does is auto just means the content size. So the starting size is 250, let's call it 253, right? 253 is the length of the words, give me 1 unit of free space. And each of the other boxes also have different content size because the words are slightly different. That's fine. So that's the starting size. And how the browser distributes the free space. So this part here and this part here. So if you're not looking at the screen, I'm sorry, because I'm using my cursor to highlight. These sections are the amount of free space. And because I have a flex value of 2, a grow value of 2, what I'm telling the browser is that give 2 units of free space to the second box, give 1 unit of space to the first box, and don't give any free space to the last box. So the browser will tell you that, okay, I have given 130 pixels of extra space to the second box. For the first box, I gave half of that. I gave 65 pixels worth of extra space. So that's why these 3 items are sized in this manner. So if you do the math, these 2 boxes are not, they are not like, box number 2 is not double of box number 1, even though you set the grow value to 2, because that's not how it works. If you really wanted a sizing pattern, let's say, where one box is twice of the other, you have to set the basis to 0. But because when you set the basis to 0, the browser ignores the content size altogether. So now that I'm highlighting this box, the second example box, where the flex basis has been set to 0. So if you look at the calculation section, the content size, 0. So all the free space is now being divided in a ratio of 1:2 between the first box and the second box. So if we look at the numbers here, 312 for the first box is exactly half, given some sub-pixel rounding error, of the second box, which is about 625. So that is a distinction, and depending on the use case that you're trying to build in your layout, is something to take note of if you're using Flexbox quite a lot for laying out all your items. Something that has been introduced with Flexbox and also Grid is the aligning of flex items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh the page. So if you look at this last section on the page, this is again another flex container, and I'm going to highlight it so we can all see. There's free space because my items are like unevenly sized, right? And they are a set of box alignment properties, which for now we can only use when the display is flex or grid. But in the future, so depending on how browsers want to implement this, there are plans to bring these box alignment values into like the traditional display block and this the older layout models that we have. But I think this will take some time. So let's look at it in a flex context first. So when we set a display flex onto a container and all the children become flex items, one thing that you may have encountered is that all your items end up being stretched. All your items end up being stretched to the height of the tallest item, right? And this is expected behavior. The default value for the default alignment value for your flex items is to stretch the height. So if you didn't want that, what you could do is you could use some of the box alignment properties. So right now I'm going to use align items. So what align items does is it allows you to adjust the alignment of your boxes in a vertical plane if you're doing a default horizontal layout. So let's try this. So when I do align items to start, then you'll see that everyone reverts to their original heights. So all my content actually had different heights to begin with because the content was sized differently. So align items allows us to align items along the vertical axis. So there are a number of different values. There's start, there's center, and there's end, depending on how you want. There's also a fairly, I would say, interesting value. I built this example specifically to use font sizes with text that are different. So if you look at it, even if I size it to center, for example, the line is very uneven, but there is this option called baseline. And what baseline does is that it actually aligns. So if you look at the dotted line, right, you'll notice that even though all my text is different font sizes, it will align all of them onto the same baseline. So that's also quite interesting, I would say. I mean, sometimes depending on the type of thing you're trying to build, I would guess this is more relevant for maybe more editorial style, or if you're doing like quite unique layouts. Sometimes you want to have like poster style things where you want your text to align across different boxes. This could be an option that you want to pursue. So align items is for the vertical axis. What you can do if you want to shift your items, because as you can see highlighted here, there's like a bunch of free space here. You don't have to just, align all your things to the left, for example. And if you want to align all your items based on the free space, you can use justify content. So N will push it to the end. What justify content is interesting is that it also allows you to distribute space between your items. So there's a set of keywords that start with space. So you can see space around, space between, and space evenly. What this property does is that it distributes all this excess space between your items. So we have a lot more options in terms of how to distribute free space within our container to kind of align all the different items within the container. So I think this is a pretty good addition for us who wants to build layouts. So I think there's a lot more to Flex, but I think these are the more I would say interesting things to note. So I'm going to move on to Flex Grid, because like I think there's been quite a lot of hype about Grid, but I've also found that there are some folks who still haven't tried it before, and I haven't seen it used like in actual production sites like extensively. To be fair, I checked can I use stats yesterday night, and the browser support is at about 93%. So I think that's quite solid to use. If like 93% of internet users are already using Grid, I think it doesn't hurt to try. I'm not saying you must use it, but it definitely doesn't hurt to try. Like you can't say browser support is a reason for you not to give it a shot anymore. So let's just briefly talk about like the basics of Grid, right? Again, I like using Firefox for this because again, under the layout panel, there's also a Grid section. So if you haven't used Grid for your layout, you have this tag that you can click on again, or you can do it here. What's nice about Firefox's Grid overlay is that you can have multiple. So because all my examples are grids, I actually have 4 grids on this page, and I can kind of highlight, I can turn the overlay on for all of them at the same time, which is like, I would say it's quite helpful if your layout, you're doing 2 separate grids and they're kind of related to each other and you want to see if they align. This is very, very helpful. There are additional display options for the overlay. So I definitely want display line number, so I always have it on by default. But you can also extend the lines infinitely. So again, like I mentioned, it does look a bit messy, but it's very helpful if you have like 2 separate grids apart from each other that you want to line up. So I'm going to turn this, usually I turn this off. Turn this off as well. And then if you look at the syntax, I'm personally quite like this syntax a lot because it's kind of a visual syntax. So after you display grid, what you need to do is you have to define the number of columns and rows you want for your items to sit into. So you use grid template columns and grid template rows for this. So for columns, as you can see, I have 3 different values. 3 separate values gives me 3 separate columns. 2 separate values for rows give me 2 rows. So it feels quite intuitive to me. Might not be for everyone, but personally, I quite like this syntax. And so this is a 3 by 2 grid, and each grid line has its own line number that you can use to place items. So let's look at the actual placing of items on a grid. So this second example is a 3 by 3. It's a 3 by 3 grid. Turn this on. And if you look at the markup for this particular example, there's only 3 children inside. I've made them 3 chess pieces. And in order to place them at these specific positions, what I do is the syntax here is a grid row. So what's different from the parent syntax is that for the parent syntax, you use grid template columns and grid template rows. But to actually place your items itself, skip the template, you just use grid row. So for this first item, I want it to be in the first column. So actually I don't have to do anything for the column, but for the row, I want it to be placed at the bottom row. So the grid line here is 3. So when I set it to 3, it gets pushed down to this corner here. The second one, I do have to define a column because I'm moving it to the right. So it's now grid row 2, grid column 2, and same goes for the last one. Just give it grid row 3, grid column 3. And that's how you kind of define where you want to place your items on the grid. So even though I know, like, if you really look into all the things that grid can do, there's a lot of different properties. I think this is actually good enough for you to get started. You have a grid and then you just place stuff in the grid. I think that's good enough to start with. And once you're comfortable with this, then you can start exploring the more complicated syntaxes. But one particular feature that I personally quite like for building layouts is the fact that you can name your grid area. So I'm just going to highlight this grid. Because I've turned on display names, you can see that these each of these boxes inside my grid actually kind of has a name. So how this works is that you still do a grid template columns and rows, but in addition to having your grid template columns and rows, you can kind of label areas. The syntax doesn't look very nice in DevTools because DevTools kind of does a concatenation. So again, hopefully you're looking at the screen so you can kind of see my mouse. The syntax for grid template areas, so this grid is the grid's getting bigger. This is a 6 by 6. So if you look at what I have here, there are quotation marks. So each row represents a set of values within the quotation marks. So if you actually count, I have 6 sets of quoted values. And within each of these quoted values, I have 6 column values. So if I want empty content, I would use a full stop to delineate that I don't want anything in that column. So for owl, I actually have this 3 by 3 section. I gave it to the owl emoji, and so on and so forth. There's a mouse and there's a flamingo. What is useful for this, I feel, is that if you are doing something like a full page layout, and maybe it's much more complicated than this, maybe you have up to, I mean, depending on your design, right, could like have 20 columns. You're not gonna, it's gonna be very tricky if say at a different breakpoint, right, you wanted to move your items around, and then you have to write like the sizing, the positioning of each of your items per breakpoint. That can get a bit tedious. What's useful about grid template areas is you can sort of manipulate the size and position of your grid items just from the template areas alone. So for example, let's say, let's do this. Let's say that you don't want, like, mouse doesn't need to take up so much space, right? So what you can do is you can, instead of positioning the mouse grid item, you can modify its position directly from the parent. So now, because I changed the grid template area syntax, my mouse item only takes up two cells. So I think this is a pretty good feature to have for the use case that I described. And in general, you don't even have to use like words. I have seen some of my friends use emojis as the label. So that's also accepted. The browser knows how to pass emojis, so that can be quite fun. And the last thing for grid is that this is fairly recent. I won't say it's recent anymore, but it came out in about like Firefox 66. So that's a few months already. No, actually it's about almost a year. So you can actually animate a grid row or column with CSS animations. So what I'm actually doing here is not moving the grid item across columns. You actually can't do that. But what you can do is that you can change the size of your grid cell. You can change the size of the column, you can change the size of the row. And by applying a box alignment property on this 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 content here. So as you can see, even though I only have one item here, what I'm animating, right, is the cell that the item is sitting in. So I just aligned it to the left, the lower right corner, and I just moved it around. So this is something interesting for people who want to add some animations to their layouts to explore if they are interested. Definitely check it out. And this last part is about flexible sizing, and I would say that it's I found it very interesting because, again, like I started off this presentation with sizing, and what I realized is that Flexbox and Grid, they introduce a different type of sizing algorithm that we can use for layouts. So FR is something that we can only use with Grid for now, but it represents the amount of free space left in the container. Auto is a value we've always had, so that's fine. Fit content we talked about, and there are a few other things, right? Sizing functions, and all of this together gives us this behavior that we never had before, and I'm going to explain very soon. So let's look at this first set here. When these different sizing values are used with each other, the browser will size the boxes differently. So FR, as I explained, is the amount of free space that the item can take up. So when I size 1FR, 2FR, and 1FR, the boxes are in a 1:1 ratio. So that's not hard to understand because it's everyone's using the same unit. If we size everything with auto, it actually does behave quite similarly to FR in that it kind of divides the space evenly between all three boxes. That's fine. What's interesting is when we start to mix these two sizes together. So if we do auto with FR, FR will always have will take up all the free space first. So if there's any free space, the FR box will take all of it. But as I start to shrink the browser, the space is also the first to be taken away from the FR box. So I'm going to open the console as the legend. So what you can see now is that as I shrink, the size of the blue box, okay, we're all looking at example 3 here. So let's just highlight this. The blue boxes don't change size when there's a lot of space available. And even after the green box has gone to less than max content, basically the green box is going to shrink all the way until it hits its mean content size before the auto boxes start to shrink. Eventually, when there's no space left, all the boxes are going to end up exactly the same simply because I use the same content each. But I think what I'm trying to highlight here is that when we used to use percentages to size our boxes for responsive design, I think one of the problems we had was that when you use percentage, for example, if you say 30%, 40%, 30%, when you shrink, everything shrinks at the same rate, everything grows at the same rate. But when we do this mixture of sizing values, you'll notice that things grow and shrink, but they kind of wait. You can now make things wait for each other, right? So that's only FR and auto. There are a few other examples I want to talk about. So here there are some more values. So when we use fit content, which we covered earlier, fit content and auto do behave fairly similarly in that, again, all the free space goes to the FR box first before the fit content and auto boxes start to shrink. The reason why the red box is smaller than the blue box is because I kept the width at 200. So, okay, this is still not too special. I think what's interesting is when we try to use this new function, again, only usable with grid for now. It's called a min-max function. So again, it's a range value that is kind of similar to fit content. You give it two values though. So this first value is the minimum size that the box will shrink, and then that's the maximum size. So given the amount of free space that's holding this box, right, it could be anything between 200 to 400 pixels. So you can kind of like cap the size of your box, which is great. So when we use min-max together with auto, together with fit content, what we notice is that everyone behaves a bit differently. So now if I have a lot of space, let me bring this on. So auto gets all the free space. So it kind of acts like FR, but if FR is not available, auto is the next one in line to get all the space. That's great. So as you notice, the yellow and the orange boxes have not changed size. So I'm just going to slow down. Slow down, slow down. The moment auto hits its max content size, it actually stops shrinking. And who starts to shrink next? The yellow box starts to shrink next. So the yellow box now starts shrinking from 400. And as we continue, you'll notice that the auto box starts to shrink again. And it will keep shrinking until all three, the blue, the yellow, and the orange boxes, will hit their minimum content size at the same time. So because we set the minimum content of the yellow box to 200, it's going to stop shrinking here. For the other two, they will keep going until they hit min content. And all three of these boxes will hit their minimum content size at the same time. And again, correspond, like on the opposite side, right? If we start to grow, you'll notice that they all start to grow to a certain point, but the gold box is going to stop growing at 400. And then the auto box starts to grow again. So I think what I'm trying to show here, right, is the fact that you can make your items wait for each other. And it's easier to show this with actually a live example. So I'm going to show this here, right? So these are two layouts that look very, very similar at a big screen. The issue now is that the first one, I'm using relative units. I'm using percentages. So you can see in the code here, the image is 65%. The text is 55%. Then I'm using this weird negative margin to do the overlap. As for the second one I'm using grid. And I'm using grid with the fit content and min-max properties that I tried to explain earlier. So at a large width, it's fine. But the problem that I tried to describe earlier in that is when there's not enough space, you'll notice that because I sized the first example using percentages, everyone shrinks at the same rate. So at about this point, you can already start to see the difference. You can see that this image is kind of a bit too small already. And the text is also a bit squished. There's all this space here that's like doing nothing. But if I use a flexible sizing option with grid, you can see for the second one, the space is much better managed. So I think that's a fairly good use case for this type of layout specifically. I understand some people are going to say that, oh yeah, I'm building an application, I don't need this. That's fine, because as I mentioned before, like grid is not the hammer that you use to sort of like solve all the problems. If you have this use case, go ahead and use grid. If you don't have this use case, it's fine if you don't use it. But what I find interesting about CSS in general, and this last example, it's not the best example, but what I wanted to say is that even though I was talking about layout for like the whole, I don't know, 40 minutes, half an hour, CSS is not only just layouts, right? It's not only just grid. There are so many other things that CSS can do, like, for example, make blend modes, for example. And the interesting thing about grid is that because we can now place items, we can have a grid with columns and rows, and we can place items, we can actually overlap things without them like pushing each other out. So if I go back to this example, you'll notice that this overlap of text and the image, I didn't have to use any like negative margins or anything. I simply place the image in the first row column, let it span twice. I'm just going to turn on the grid to make it obvious. I place the image in this section, and then I place the text overlapping it. I didn't have to use any negative margins or anything because it just works. And it's responsive because that's how grid works. And so when we encounter things like that, we can kind of become more creative. For For example, I can overlap things and then I can do this weird mixed blend mode thing. So I think that's what I encourage everyone to do, is to like, even if you don't do this in production, I think it's worth just trying out all these different CSS properties, because you never know, right? Like, there may be instances where you maybe have to build a dashboard, and then your dashboard has to have things that overlay each other, for example. It's always an option. I think it's always good to have more tools in the toolbox, because even though I explained so much about Flexbox and Grid, that doesn't mean all the old techniques you don't use anymore. I think there's still room for you to use floats. There's still room for us to use like a normal inline block and things like that. It's just having more, like, but once you have a new tool, that doesn't mean your old tools are useless. It just means that you have more tools to work with, and that allows us to like build even more things with CSS and become more creative with our layouts moving forward. Yeah, so I think that's about time. I actually wasn't looking at the time. So yeah, that's it for me. What should I do now?
So thank you very much for your speech. We will give you a virtual applause.
Thank you.
It's very
Thank you
good.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now we will have a question and answer session. So I think I'll ask you the first question, and it will be from me personally. If you can choose between Flexbox and Grid, can you choose something between them?
Oh my, I love this question. This is like my favorite question. So like I said, right, Flexbox and they are not exclusive. So it's not like if you use Flexbox, you cannot use Grid. So again, depending on your use case, there are situations where you can actually use both together. For example, I think if you try, if you have, usually I would say, again, depending on the design you're looking at, right, I would use Grid for like the overall structure. But for like more small alignments inside the items themselves, I would use Grid. So what happens here is that you have a grid, and inside you have all your grid items. There's nothing stopping you from making your grid item a Flexbox container. And because of the alignment properties that I explained, you can actually use display flex and the box alignment properties to kind of be even more, I would say, refined in trying to align the items inside your grid. And again, I feel that it's there's no one size fits all. So it's not that now that there's Grid, then we don't use Flexbox anymore. It's more of a, how do you want your items to be sized? So for example, right, I would say use Grid if you would like everything to line up in rows and columns, because Grid is meant for that. It's meant for everything to line up in rows or columns. Now, if you use Flexbox, on the other hand, all the items, even though, okay, I think a good example would be this one. Like this second example here, even though you wrap your items, if you inspect them, you'll notice that they don't actually align. That's because Flexbox doesn't recognize rows and columns. It treats everything as a very long line, and then when there's not enough space, it just, sweeps it underneath. So you don't have any column logic when you use Flexbox. So if you're okay with that, that's great. And if you don't need everything to be sized exactly the same, you could even just do something like, let's see, flex wrap. Oh, this is because my items are too small. But in some instances, you even end up having your bottom two items to be very big. And if you're okay with that, then go ahead and use Flex. But if you're like, no, I want everything to be like the rows and the columns to be neat and lined up, then use Grid. So to me, it's a use case basis, not say which is better than the other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sasha?
I think we have time for one question more. So the Flexbox as a feature was here like for a long time ago, but only now we getting the amazing DevTools to help us. And by your experience, how fast browsers implement proper DevTools for new CSS features? Is it enough to be effective in debugging with the implemented CSS specification in the browsers?
No, this is a great question, and this is also something that I like to talk about publicly, because the thing about the browsers, the engineers who work on the browsers, right? They also have prioritization features, and one of the factors that they use to prioritize features is public response. So every single browser, be it Chrome, Firefox, Safari, they have a bug tracker, and recently Chrome actually implemented the CSS grid overlay. Because people have raised issues on the bug tracker. They're like, we would like a CSS grid overlay like the one Firefox has. And like when a lot of people vote up on it, it's not just for fun. Like when you upvote an issue, the engineers and the browser vendors themselves do take notice. And I think the converse is true. Like if we don't use something just because we think it's broken, and we don't we don't, in fact, you don't even have to like go to the issue directly. You could do other things. You could, like, I don't know, post on social media. You can like write blog posts, and the people that work at these browser companies, they do actually pay attention to this sort of feedback. So I feel that what you raised was right. Like, why is it that only one browser has it right now? I feel that they actually are open issues on the Chrome bug tracker that also want like better grid CSS dev tools and things like that. And I think what we can do, even if we don't work at Chrome or we don't work at Google or whatever, is to like sort of star the issues, and we could also like just, you don't have to write a very long blog post. You can just like, okay, I have this issue. I'm trying to build something, and then like your dev tools not helping. It's like you don't have to be rude about it, but you can just do a short explanation. Screenshots would be nice. Like, hey, what this is something that is that's not working out for me. And I think by doing so, by providing the browser vendors that feedback, we can probably push in more features, be it for dev tools or even just CSS specs themselves, by showing that we want these things. I can safely say that they are listening. Yeah, we just have to, make it known that we want these features.
Yeah, so just ask browser if you need something to debug with.
Yeah.
They will probably listen to you, and at some point, maybe you'll get what you need.
If enough of us, so you can ask all your developer friends, like, hey, like, help me upload this. I think it works. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. AJ, I think we again thank you for amazing talk.
Thank you so much.
Virtual applause are just for you.